Welcome everyone to the STEaPP Chat with Professor Yacob Mulugetta. My name is Andreas. I'm a doctoral candidate at STEaPP, and we're here today with Professor Mulugetta to discuss network infrastructure and the delivery of essential services. This is an essential part of the MPA that we offer here at STEaPP, the Masters of Public Administration. The core module, Public Administration, covers, among other things, a discussion around regulation of liberated markets. And here today with Professor Mulugetta, who is professor at the Department for Energy and Development Policy, we want to extend the view beyond the usual scholarly literature in public administration that tends to focus around Europe, North America, Australia, New Zealand, so Eurocentric and Anglophone countries. And we want to dive a little bit into his experience and his research on the African continent. All right, to begin with, I would like to invite Yacob to tell us a little bit about the different developments of governing network infrastructures in Africa compared to Europe. What's the difference and how have they emerged differently in the African context?
Well, thank you for the invitation. And before launching into network infrastructures, I think it's worth providing some kind of a bit of a background in terms of looking at these services that may come from energy or transport or water and so forth, which are really what network infrastructures are really about. So most of what I will be talking about would be energy, because that's a subject I know fairly well, particularly when it comes to the African context. Now, some background information. Well, first of all, there is a significant infrastructure deficit in Africa. This is now and historically. If you look at the access question in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, we're talking about 70% of the population does not have access to electricity. This is something equivalent to the whole of Spain. So essentially, you're talking about 1 billion people, or roughly thereabouts, whose consumption and whose access to energy is less than that of a country like Spain. That's one aspect. The second aspect is also that people consume, even those who have access to electricity, their consumption levels are fairly low. And so what this creates, it creates its own limitations, as I will explain in a moment. But I think another aspect of it, which is also worth exploring, mentioning here, is that Africa's engagement with network infrastructure is one has to look at the colonial experience in order to be able to understand how it all began. And although we don't want to go too far into it, but that experience, so the network infrastructure has to be seen in the shadows of that colonial experience, where when electricity was introduced, it wasn't intended necessarily for household or community consumption or whatever. That was fundamentally to try and support existing communities, that is European communities, but also to support industrialization and other activities such as minerals exploration and so forth. So in a sense, energy was, or the electricity sector evolved in relation to the type of productive sector that was visible in Africa. And so what it means is that, what you have here is that the dominance of the modern sector in connecting with the infrastructure sector, whether it's electricity or roads and what have you. So in essence, you're talking about a very large proportion of the population that is rural, which effectively has been shut out from any of these services. And so what we find ourselves in Africa is quite unique in the sense that, it is a fairly rural community. Economics is agrarian, very rural, in comparison to Asia or Latin America. And many of these other countries other regions have done quite well, fundamentally because they do have a fairly urban population. And so network infrastructures become easier to be able to implement in those sorts of settings.
This is very interesting. This is actually showing that the political economy questions around development play a significant role when designing policy for network infrastructures. How did that design actually look like? What are the design components that a policymaker in government have to consider when considering regulating network infrastructures?
Well, I mean, the policy design in some ways is defined by the challenge, by the context itself. And of course, I mean, African countries also went through major, restructuring and structural adjustment programs, many of which, in my view, didn't quite work, particularly when you're talking about network industries. And so the policymakers, by and large, are in a kind of firefighting mode almost constantly. I mean, there's a tendency where some people argue, well, there is a lot of corruption, etc., etc. All of those things, may exist, but I think the reality, at least, what I've seen on the ground, is that, it is a pretty tough territory to be able to manage. So that's important, to keep that in mind, that what we're dealing with is, situations where tariffs needed to be kept at a fairly low level partly for political reasons. And therefore, what then that creates is that, it creates a system that isn't, financially fluid. And therefore, you have, from the outset, policymakers are challenged with a major financial problem of not being able to raise enough resources to be able to reinvest and so forth. And the very fact that you take Ethiopia as an example. It's a country with a population of over 100 million. 80 to 85% of the population is rural. And so what we're looking at is a situation where the level of access is quite limited, and therefore the policymakers are effectively operating with about 20-25% of the population dispersed in different parts of the country. Now that also creates this kind of dispersal creates its own challenges, infrastructural challenges. On the one hand, you're dealing with people who are poor and unable to not only access the services, but also unable to pay for services, for that matter. And on the other hand, what you have is also a situation where the transmission lines are not in any position, to be able to reach these communities for two reasons. Number one, they are very much far apart, from where the generation is. But the second aspect is also the question about ability to pay is not quite there. So the state is constantly fighting, to try and raise revenue, try to raise money to be able to invest, but unable to be able to invest in areas that would expand the infrastructure to be able to cover larger proportions of the community. So therefore, at the moment, there is a different mode of thinking. In the past, you had, when one talked about electricity, everyone, the thinking was about interconnected systems. At the moment, given that there is such a large proportions of people, dispersed in different parts of the countries, the thinking at the moment is to do a mix between centralized and decentralized systems. So that is beginning to enter into our policy discussions.
That's very interesting. I mean, if you allow me the comparison to some countries in Latin America, actually, which colonial past as well,
right,
which struggle with many political economy-related questions, possibly similar to the ones in Africa. The accessibility question there is not as much of an issue anymore because some of these problems were solved. So the issue of off-grid did not have to be established to that extent, which allowed the state obviously to keep much tighter control on transmission, generation, and not so much on provision,
Absolutely,
but especially on the generation and transmission. How does this look in the African context? How does the state try to manage this split almost between, on one hand, having an interconnected grid, on the other hand, being forced to provide decentralized off-grid services. Is that something that is regulated and controlled through the state? Is that something that is given to private providers, or is it even lucrative for the private sector to get embezzled in that, or is it something that the state very much keeps an eye on?
Yeah, it's a mix. I mean, depending on which country you're looking at. But I think one of the key commonalities across countries is that you have, on the one hand, utilities tend to be responsible for the centralized systems. When you start talking about engaging them for decentralized systems, historically there's been a tendency, a reticence to be involved in that. I mean, partly because it doesn't pay for itself, in essence. So if you're talking about distributed generation, whether it's diesel or renewables, you are talking about I mean, it's getting a lot better now, but historically, significantly more per kilowatt hour than what you would generate using a centralized system, which is obvious because you have economy of scales and so forth. So what tends to happen is that the distributed generation or the rural electrification programs tend to be historically handled by other entities, whether it's local agencies or in many cases even donor communities that would provide or would support programs for rural electrification. So any kind of rural electrification that the utility was involved tended to be in connection with the centralized grid system. So what you have there is a split of responsibilities and a split of investment, as well. Because if you're talking about state-based investment, that tends to go into centralized systems, and so the distributed generation systems tend to get less of, they're not as important in terms of investment opportunities.
This actually shows quite the challenge that policymakers have to take into account. But if you have the policy, what actually happens on the ground? If we think about the implementation of these policies, what are the challenges that governments face when they have to implement the regulation when it comes to network infrastructures?
Well, I mean, you have a number of policies. One is, you have challenges. One is, there is a serious capacity challenge on the ground, whether it's, at utility level or at policy-making level. So I think, there are big question marks around the capacity of the public administration systems. And again, the experience across countries is different. There are some that that do relatively well. Countries such as Kenya, for example, in West Africa, you may think about Cote d'Ivoire. Kenya and Ethiopia are quite different, even though they are right next door to each other. So, there are variations in terms of experience. But when you begin to start looking at implementing projects on the ground, I mean, I have to say that there has been a pretty significant improvement over the years, particularly in the past 5-6 years. Even the World Bank is supporting, a variety of programs, particularly the ones that are known as last mile programs, for example, in Kenya, which managed to reduce its access levels or increase access levels from around 25 to 30%, in a matter of a few years to about 55%. So we're achieving, some good results. But of course, there's also the question around how do you recover your investment? So in the case of Kenya, what you have is they have a fairly what they would call cost-reflective tariffs. So in essence, the tariff pays for itself, and therefore and so forth. And of course, when you begin to start investing in these last mile, because the last mile programs, for instance, are about supporting households to be connected. and that costs $600 US dollars per household, which is not really affordable for households. So in essence, what then happened is that was integrated into the tariff structure in Kenya. So that raised, as you can imagine, raised the prices, but it also created another unforeseen problem. One problem was those communities that were connected. Some of the communities that were connected were unable to use electricity, simply because the cost of electricity on a per kilowatt basis was expensive. So they feared, that cost. And then you have an almost opposite problem next door in Ethiopia, which has among the lowest tariff in the world at roughly 2 US cents per kilowatt hours. And as you would imagine, that there is a different philosophy there. The philosophy there is about electricity for as a public good is very much it has been very much at the heart of the country's policy thinking. But of course, what this creates is that it creates its own problems in terms of not being able to raise enough revenues to be able to pay for the investment that's going to be required for that extra 70% of people who are in need of electrification.
So who's responsible for that in Ethiopia? Is it the state who's running the electricity utilities?
It is. I mean, it is until now. It is the state. So Ethiopia had a vertically integrated system, and for until recently, and just about a year or two ago, it began to unbundle that. So you have your generation, transmission, and distribution, rather generation and transmission together, and distribution on its own. But still, it is in the hands of the state. The state still, manages these. But what's happened in recent years is Ethiopia has remained, you could call it a very strong state, and has invested a lot in generation, and is investing a lot in transmission. But what's happening also is that it's beginning to run out of resources to be able to continue to invest, and therefore the emergence of the private sector as an important player has come on the policy platform recently. But yes, I mean, the state plays a significant role, much more than in places like Kenya, and also in a state of debt as well, perhaps much more than those other countries. At the same time, it's also the size of the projects that the country is taking on are quite significant. You're talking about 6,000 megawatts, for example, along the Nile hydro programs. When I started working on Ethiopia, we were talking about less than a 1,000 megawatts. Right now it's over 4,000, and the projections are that in a matter of within the next 10 years, that will rise to about 20,000. So there is a lot of projects in the pipeline, but those projects have to be paid for somehow.
And so far that has been mostly the state. If we think about the people, actually, if we think about who benefits from these services, what can you say about the impact of these different strategies that different countries have been using to deliver these services? I mean, you just mentioned Kenya and Ethiopia with markedly different approaches.
Yeah.
And then when thinking about the prices, that is obviously something that the end consumer then feels in their pocket. So with all these development questions in the back of your head, and the general political economy framework in which these regulations and the general approach to delivering essential services is embedded, how does it play out for the consumer? What are the strategies that benefit, and what are the costs that they're paying?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's worth sort of separating two things out. One is you have the utility, or the electricity that's delivered by the utility, and then the other one is exploring what options there are in mini grids and off grid. So I mean, if you're taking the utility, of course, the utility can take you up to a certain point. When you have a population that is dispersed across large territories of land. Not only that, but also some settlements and communities are too small to be able to for them to be connected to the grid. So right there, what you have is a dilemma of how far can you stretch yourself. And so, in terms of the existing users, I mean, in Kenya, clearly, you have, there's that interesting challenge of being connected, but at the same time, electricity being relatively expensive. Now, this isn't just in Kenya. If you go to West Africa, you have the same issues. You go to Uganda, next door to Kenya, it's roughly around the same sort of price per kilowatt hours. And so what this does is that it doesn't allow for, the kind of the widening of access in a structured and in a programmed way. And you have exactly the same thing happening in West Africa, as I was just saying. And so you have to have that strategy. What do you do with that, the remaining 45%? And that remaining 45%, would need to be catered for using still relatively expensive, distributed, electricity generated, from small-scale systems. Ethiopia's challenge is slightly different. I mean, it is absorbing a lot of debt as a country, largely because the state is so present in the supply of power. But at the same time, there is also an internal discussion at the moment about raising tariff, but raising tariff in a way that doesn't harm those who are consuming less than 50 kilowatt hours per month or so. So the first kilowatt hours would probably remain more or less where they are now, but then there would be a kind of a sharp increase. That's my take on it, and this is really at the heart of the kind of pro-poverty or rather pro-poor type of policy that the country has embarked on.
Finally, Yacob, I would like to invite you to foreshadow a little bit. What do you think will happen in the near future? We see these trends about privatizing or having a tighter control through the state, like in Ethiopia. What will we see in the near future in Africa or generally around the world in the development context?
Well, I think we're observing a trend where the role of the private sector is going to be much more than it has been in the past. And of course, what we see in Uganda, in Kenya, and various parts of West Africa, like Senegal, is a strong or a vibrant engagement with the private sector. And often this private sector that we're talking about is a private sector from international private sectors, that is. Now, in Ethiopia's case, the new policy or the new thinking is also heading in that sort of direction. The liberalization of the power sector is definitely on the table. Part of the reason for this is because the country wants to expand its power sector. It sees also an important opportunity to expand that, not just to supply for rural areas, but also it is growing at a fairly rapid rate. You have 18 or 19 industrial parks that are cropping up in different parts of the country. That each of these requires at least 150 megawatts capacity. At the same time, it's also the country is also looking at to export into the East African power pool to become as an important supplier of power. Part of the drive or part of the attraction for this is to generate foreign currency, because that's one thing which is in very short supply everywhere. Yeah. So I think these are the strategic issues that the countries are having to face. On the one hand, you have the need to widen your electrification into the social development arenas. On the other hand, you've got their economies are expanding. They want to sell. They want to be competitive, and therefore there is that pressure on that side, on the economic side. And if you don't, keep a fairly affordable, or whatever that means, price on electricity, then you don't become competitive. And then on the third hand, you do have a burgeoning, or at least an ambitious regional integration program for energy, which is another attraction. Now there, you may have a competition between countries that want to produce and supply. So there may be a competition, between countries, that might be able to generate power at competitive prices. And already, the transmission lines are expanding. Ethiopia, Kenya, Djibouti, Tanzania, these are interconnected systems at the moment. So these are the interesting sort of issues that are beginning to emerge. Headache for policymakers, for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Yacob. That just means that there's going to be a lot more research that needs to be done, like we do here at STEaPP, and a lot more work that we will do with our MPAs. So this is the end of the STEaPP Chat with Professor Mulugetta. I hope you learned a lot about network infrastructure regulations in the development context in Africa, and we're looking forward to the next one in due time. Thank you.